Russia. We don't often think of it as a colonial power. We associate colonies primarily with the overseas conquests of Spain, France, and Britain. But Russia has been colonizing its neighboring territories for centuries, primarily in Asia. Its actions follow the same mechanisms as the colonization process of Western countries: the exploitation of natural resources, forced modernization, the creation of local elites to strengthen the position of the colonizer, and the imposition of its own language and culture. Kazakhstan is a prime example of Russian colonization. But after more than 3 decades of independence, it is still struggling with decolonization. In this film, we ask, what progress has been made? And does Russia still pose a threat to Kazakhstan?
The Kazakhs were a nomadic people whose livelihood was based on their large herds of horses, camels, and cattle. They migrated twice a year to their summer and winter pastures. In fact, just like we did at the dawn of agriculture, we had a 2-field system. First, one field was sown so that the other could regenerate. It's similar to how nomads do it. Pastures also lay fallow. They needed time to recover so they could sustain people and livestock. Tsarist Russia first began to settle Slavs in Kazakh lands in the north and then increasingly southwards. This was already in the time of the Cossacks, who were settled there in new fortresses. There were also Russian peasants sent there before the First World War as part of Stolypin's reforms. Jumping ahead in time, I can say that demographers, researchers, Kazakh historians reckon that 8.5 million people were sent to the Kazakh steppe, willingly or otherwise. At the end of the 10th century, the Kazakh territories had around 3 or 4 million people, 80% of whom were Kazakhs. There were 3, maybe 3.5 million of them. We don't have precise figures, of course, but it was on that scale. But according to the Soviet census of 1959, there were fewer than 3 million Kazakhs, 2.9 million. So over that 60 years, the population fell. But it's even more drastic if we look at the proportions. It's bad enough in absolute figures because instead of natural growth, there was a fall in the population. But in proportional terms, the initial 80% of Kazakhs fell back to 30%, with Russians making up 40% of the population. So in 1959, Kazakhs were a minority in their own country, in their own republic.
After the Stalinist period, this trend reversed, and the percentage of Kazakhs began to grow once again. However, up to the fall of the USSR, they did not form an absolute majority in their own country. That changed only with an independent Kazakhstan, and also because many minorities decided to leave the country.
I even remember a joke from the 1990s when times were really bad in Kazakhstan before the country started receiving the petrodollars, which helped it build an economy on a large scale in the region. People were not receiving their salaries, and one Kazakh says to another, "You see, the Germans have gone to Germany, the Jews to Israel, the Poles to Poland. Where can we go?"
Currently, Kazakhs make up around 70% of Kazakhstan's population, but due to many decades of Russification, Russian remains in widespread use.
Tsarist Russia started by dividing up nomadic routes. The nomads changed pastures twice a year, and if their routes passed through some good land, it turned out that they were not allowed there, because that land now belonged to someone else. Someone else was farming there and doing something different. Then Bolshevik Russia, Communist Russia completely banned nomadic pastoralism because they couldn't feel secure with nomads. One day they're here, the next they're there. It's not easy to monitor these people, so they forcibly settled them and confiscated their herds. So a lifestyle which they had been used to for generations, suddenly and very quickly, in just a few years, was taken from them. There were cases where the nomads preferred to kill off their herds rather than give them up to the kolkhoz, to the state. The numbers are horrifying. No one has compiled data for the effects of collectivization for the whole of Kazakhstan. Closed archives are still a problem, although they are gradually being opened. But we do have compiled data for individual districts. 2 years ago, while I was traveling Kazakhstan, I spoke to a local historian in Zhezkazgan called Turganbek Alanyazov. He told me that in a small area of one district, the number of cattle was 40 times lower after literally a few years of collectivization. He told me that in a small area of one district, the number of cattle was 40 times lower after literally a few years of collectivization.
The overall outcome of the Russian presence on the territory of today's Kazakhstan is not clear-cut. It's both development and civilization progress, but also environmental destruction and the disruption of natural development of the local population. For the Soviet Union, the Kazakh steppe also constituted a form of a natural, open-air prison.
Kazakhstan was one large destination for deportations, for repression, for the Gulag. The largest camp was called Karlag, short for Karaganjinsky Lager, through which 1 million people passed. Karlag was larger than modern-day Slovenia. It was simply huge, 300 kilometers from north to south and only a little less from east to west. It was simply a state which functioned its own closed regime, but which had its own colonies. There was the Algier camp, an acronym from Russian, meaning the Akhmalins camp for wives of traitors to the fatherland. They sent family members of repressed people there. If someone was accused of treason, they were usually shot, and then his wife would be sent for, say, 10 years to this Algier. There were people sent there whose names are in encyclopedias. For example, one of the most celebrated dancers of the 20th century, Maya Plisetskaya, was there with her mother. Her father, her mother's husband, was a Soviet diplomat and had been shot. Besides this, we had the deported nations. Stalinist policy deported national minorities to the border area of countries considered unfriendly to ensure that no fifth column could be recruited. This also obviously had an impact on the demographic situation in Kazakhstan, and at the moment of independence it turned out that Kazakhs did not form a majority, that there are entire areas, for example on the border with Russia, where ethnic Russians form the majority of citizens, that there are entire areas and groups where no one knows the state language at all, and Kazakhstan had to tackle this inheritance when it was constructing its own independence.
However, there were more consequences of Russian colonization which the new state had to deal with. During the Soviet era, Kazakhstan was the site of a large-scale social experiment, and deportees featured strongly in it.
These people were used in the Soviet modernization project. They brought about Kazakhstan's Sovietization. The first generation lived in extremely harsh conditions there, but they somehow managed to scrape a living, and it then turned out that they would later play the role of hosts for those coming to Kazakhstan later. This melting pot was supposed to form the model Soviet man, uprooted, Russian-speaking, whose homeland was the Soviet Union. So it was the scene of social experiments, but also of weapons experiments. We need to mention the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site.
The effects of these scientific experiments had serious implications for people living in Kazakhstan.
The nuclear test site, the Baikonur Cosmodrome, they are also an element of a kind of progress, but rocket fuel contains many harmful substances which are released when it's burned. I spoke to residents of Kyzyloda, a town around 200 kilometers from the Cosmodrome. They say they always feel bad when there's a rocket launch, around the whole town. Now there are a few launches due to the sanctions. They're not so common. In fact, it was the most used spaceport in the world. Now more launch from Cape Canaveral or the Chinese spaceports, for example. There's also the Aral Sea, which is drying out. At the moment, there are 3 smaller bodies of water split between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The Kazakh part is regenerating a little because the Sea Daria reaches what we now call the North Aral Sea in Kazakhstan. But the Amu Daria dries out before it reaches the Aral Sea. This was linked to intensive water usage in cotton fields in the south of Central Asia. Canals were built to take water from the large rivers, and they also used lots of pesticides and different kinds of fertilizers, which made their way into the groundwaters and to the Aral Sea as it shrank to 1/9 of its previous size. In around the 70s, it had an area of 70,000 square kilometers. Suddenly, it began to shrink. It may have been a partly natural process because historically the sea has receded. Archaeologists found the remains of cemeteries and strongholds on the seabed, so it wasn't underwater then. But certainly it never receded so quickly within a single generation as happened during the Soviet event. There was also a project which fortunately was not implemented. They were going to change the course of Siberian rivers. They planned to change the course of rivers which run north-south so that they'd run latitudinally in order to bring more water to the territories. If that had been implemented, half of Asia would have had no water.
Russia's attitude towards the local population was also part of its colonial stance towards Kazakhstan. Kazakhs did not receive the same treatment as Russians.
First of all, they had to know Russian to have any chance at a career. There were no examples of people from the colonized territories, I'm mainly talking about Central Asia and the Caucasus now, of them rising to the highest office. The only exception was Joseph Stalin, who was a Georgian. He had some people from the Caucasus in his inner circle, of course, but after Stalin, from the traditionally Muslim countries, Haydar Aliyev climbed the highest, becoming a deputy prime minister of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev. Then Gorbachev removed him. The peak of a career would be becoming party secretary at home, though there were cases where a Russian was sent instead. The first post-perestroika clashes took place in Kazakhstan when Gorbachev sent a Russian for the position of first secretary of the party there. People took to the streets demanding to know why it couldn't be a Kazakh, or a local Russian, or at least someone who'd worked there for a while. But he was simply cabled in for the job. When perestroika began, it was characteristic for a conquered and colonized people to demand the return of their dignity. So if there was a Ukrainian in Ukraine, a Georgian in Georgia, why should Kazakhstan have a Russian as first secretary?
Russians living in Kazakhstan had a sense of superiority towards Kazakhs.
When Kazakhs didn't support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a feeling started to emerge. Local Russians wrote things on social media like, "We taught you how to use the toilet and you're so ungrateful," or "We brought you enlightenment." The Kazakhs I spoke to always respond by saying, "If we had such a good time under your boot heel, then why were there so many uprisings?" In the 18th century, the 19th century, and 1916, there was a large uprising of the people of Central Asia, including Kazakhs, which was partly an anti-colonial uprising. Why did they rebel if things were so good? I give the example of the poet Hakim Bulibek in my book. He was trained as a physicist and his doctorate specialized in lasers. After he got his PhD, he went to the Soviet research station in the Antarctic. He spoke about how they treated him. These were scientists, researchers, polar explorers. He said they treated him like a talking monkey. He said he wasn't a worse specialist than them, and he wrote good poems in their language, but they treated him like someone inferior. For example, they asked him if it's true that when they have a guest in Kazakhstan, they give him their wife. On the one hand, Kazakhs started to have a sense of injustice, but on the other hand, they had a feeling of inferiority. I've traveled around Kazakhstan a lot and have had many awkward situations. At first glance, before contact is made, I was treated as a Russian. I speak Russian quite well, so it's natural they think I'm a Russian after the first few sentences. For example, I was at the Burabai resort. In Russian it's Borovoye, a real natural marvel. The flat steppeland, and suddenly it rises up into a mountain scene, mountain lakes, Kazakh forests. The Kazakhs call it the Kazakh Switzerland. We'd bought a trip with a 2-hour guided tour around the area. The bus was already leaving and there were only Kazakhs on board, and the guide started to talk Kazakh. But when we got on the bus, she saw us and instantly switched to Russian without asking the locals. It was instinctive. She saw 2 non-Kazakhs, so she had to speak Russian. I looked at people's faces and I realized that these were mainly people from South Kazakhstan, where Russian, after 20 years of independence, possibly isn't so widespread. They of course still generally speak Russian in the big cities. Almaty, the old capital, is Russian-speaking. But to the south, in Shymkent and Taraz, these old settlements, they use Russian less there. And those people who'd bought a tour like us, who had paid their money, they wanted it to be in their language and they were disappointed. We were, of course, very embarrassed about it. We hadn't been expecting special treatment. Of course, we wanted someone to tell us what we can see out the right window and the left window, but this situation struck me as showing that 16 years after independence, Russians are still treated as someone better. You need to adapt for them. I remember another story. I got into a minibus going from Kyzyloda to Zhezkazgan in the center of the country. It's a short trip for Kazakhstan, around 400 kilometers, but it takes 9 hours because the roads are so awful. I get in and the driver told the passenger sitting next to him to move. It was the best seat because there's more legroom. Usually the seats are very cramped with the seats next to each other so they can squeeze in as many people as possible, but there's a bit more room up front. And the driver told the person who was sitting there to move because a Russian had got on the bus and we needed to give him the best spot. Of course, there's an aspect of hospitality, of courtesy about it too. But I also think there's a post-colonial aspect deep inside the people.
One element of Kazakhstan breaking the ties with its colonial past are attempts at popularizing the Kazakh language.
When you talk to Kazakhs now, they sometimes joke that in 2 years of war in Ukraine, Putin has done more for the Kazakh language than Nazarbayev in 33 years in power. This is obviously an exaggeration because Nazarbayev really did a lot for Kazakh. He started off with very many Russians, and that's why he moved the capital from the south of the country to the north, in order to drag Kazakh statehood into territory where there were practically no Kazakhs. But we still sometimes hear Russians saying that the north doesn't belong to the Kazakhs, and that maybe once they're done with Ukraine, they'll go after North Kazakhstan. The Kazakhs are very afraid of this. Nazarbayev had to tread very carefully. For example, there was the idea of changing the alphabet from Cyrillic to Latin. Work started on it and was supposed to end in 2025. I doubt it'll be finished by then, especially since it sparked huge Russian protests. Kazakhstan is joined to Russia by thousands of threads. For example, 80% of hydrocarbons, Kazakh petroleum, is exported via the Russian Federation. Russia, of course, makes money on this, but it's still a dependency, and Russia is able to demonstrate how it can harm Kazakhstan. So Nazarbayev did it cautiously. He launched the concept of trilinguality, that Kazakhs can speak 3 languages at the same time: Kazakh, Russian, and English. It's worth mentioning that when you buy any Kazakh product, there are 3 languages on the label. I even remember that in small towns at the bus depot there are announcements in 3 languages about the next bus to the nearest village. Things like that. So he has done a lot. But Kazakhs got very scared by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it drove them on. Many places now have a Kazakh language club. Rock bands have done a lot to promote Kazakh culture. There's a boy band called 91 after the year Kazakhstan gained independence. They sing exclusively in Kazakh. You can read comments on YouTube, many of them in Russian, from Russian-speaking Kazakhs saying, "I'm ashamed that I speak Kazakh so badly. Thank you for singing in Kazakh. It's helping me understand my mother tongue better." So things are moving in this direction. The Kazakh aspect is growing stronger. This is something we monitor in the Center for Eastern Studies because we think decommunization is incredibly important. They didn't use the word decolonization in Kazakhstan for many years because they didn't want to damage relations with Russia. And anyway, in the Soviet narrative, they claimed it was internationalism. It's only now that many Kazakhs are realizing that they were a colonized country. Thanks to the war in Ukraine, they are realizing that they were a colony and that Russia was a colonial power. Russia doesn't want to hear this. Russia claims it was spreading culture, that it had a civilizing mission. They conquered and all that, but they think they brought more benefits than harm.
And Kazakhstan will be dealing with its colonial past for many years to come.
I remember a history textbook. On the cover was a train with a red star, and all around it were nomads on horses and camels staring at the train. The train obviously symbolized the progress arriving in that train, and they represented the world which was about to change. Now we can deconstruct this illustration because the train driver is already a Kazakh, not a Russian, and the people on horseback are returning. Not so long ago, the magazine Science published an article about the domestication of the horse in Kazakh lands 5,500 years ago. They are incredibly proud of this tradition. Naturally, we can't reverse history. We can't return to the times before the Russians arrived, because now it's not possible to restart a nomadic lifestyle. It's already a settled nation. There's no simple way to reverse the harm that was done. I've spoken to many non-ethnic Kazakhs who say they now feel like second-class citizens. They really thought they were in charge, and now it turns out that if you don't speak Kazakh, then you can't even become a district leader. There's no easy way out of this. Nobody is repressing them. The Russian language is still recognized. It's not an official state language, but it's accepted in the administration. It's an interethnic language of communication, and documents are written in that language. There are no limits in the business world, and it's possible to get by without knowing Kazakh. But it is an independent country, a Kazakh state. When it comes to individuals, of course, some will feel they're being ill-treated, and in some specific cases there may really be some discrimination. Kazakhs are trying to redress historical crimes without committing new ones. But it's their country, it's Kazakhstan. It gained independence 33 years ago, and it's a country on the world map which increasingly understands what it wants to be like and how it wants to develop, how it wants its future to be, without forgetting about its traditions.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this one from the region.